Last year, Todd Howard told us that Skyrim has sold over 60 million copies. 60 million. That's not far off the entire population of my country, the United Kingdom. This puts it in the top 10 best-selling games of all time. But perhaps even more amazing is the fact that Skyrim managed to achieve this by capturing an audience that previously had very little interest in fantasy role-playing games in general. But in 2011, that all changed. Dragons, potions, and sorcery were suddenly mainstream. I'm certainly not saying that Skyrim did this single-handedly. Other RPGs definitely played a role, Skyrim's predecessor, Oblivion, being one of them, as well as the early Witcher and Dragon Age games, just to name a few examples. There's also no doubt in my mind that the massive popularity of World of Warcraft from 2004 onwards was another huge contributor to bring in what had formerly been considered games for nerds into the mainstream. But even then, I don't think that it was the same demographic who played Warcraft that were now flocking to Skyrim. I'm talking here about the people who, prior to Skyrim, mostly played FIFA and Madden on their PlayStation or Xbox, and previously might have scoffed at the idea of brewing potions and casting conjuration spells. Even to this day, I speak to so many people who have barely played anything outside of Call of Duty and a few sports games, who still think that playing World of Warcraft is some sort of social taboo, but they have still inexplicably played and enjoyed Skyrim. But why? What did Skyrim do to create this seismic shift and bring mass appeal to fantasy RPGs? And how did the game sustain that interest for so many years? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about for the remainder of this video. Let's start with how Skyrim captured mass interest in the first place. Well, marketing certainly played a role. Many of you probably remember the Skyrim marketing campaign, especially that main cinematic which took the fairly unusual form of a live action trailer. It was a very cool introduction to the game's main premise, with our protagonist casually strolling up to this terrifying dragon through a crowd of fleeing villagers, and then proceeding to just stare him down from point blank range. It also cuts off just before the battle commences, leaving this feeling of suspense. You are left thinking, surely that guy's toast. The dragon's just going to incinerate him in the first second. And then, wait, am I going to be playing as that guy? And by building suspense around this epic confrontation, I felt like Bethesda had just made a promise to me as the player. A promise that this was going to be something that we hadn't seen from them before. A promise that this was going to be an adventure of truly epic proportions. And I think a lot of people felt the same way, which resulted in that early adopter audience being far larger than it had typically been for other games in the genre. But marketing can of course only get you so far. Even if you're successful in getting people through the gates, you need to deliver on the promises you made in your marketing material. You need to capture the player's interest within minutes, if not seconds. And perhaps most importantly of all, you need to impress them so much that you earn their recommendation. Positive peer review needs to kick in pretty quickly to facilitate the kind of exponential growth that Skyrim benefited from. And for that to happen, your game has to be good. Well, in fact, it has to be great. So what did we hear people talking about in those early days when they recommended Skyrim to their friends? What were those big selling points that convinced the mainstream to give Skyrim a shot, and then hooked their interest for sometimes hundreds or even thousands of hours? Well, I think a big contributor was the open world freedom that the game offered. Part of this was due to the sheer scale of the world, which seemed pretty impressive back then. You probably remember when new games used to release and people would get all excited about the game world being so big, and how people's jaws dropped when they realised that you could walk from one side to the other without any loading screens. Of course, that's kind of gone in the opposite direction now, and many of us actually feel a sense of dread when we hear how big a game world is, as that often means procedurally generated or empty these days, with Starfield sadly falling foul of that to some extent. But in the case of Skyrim, it wasn't just the scale of the world that impressed, it was the player agency offered. The genuine feeling of being able to pick your own adventure within that world. You could leave Helgen and just ignore the main quest. You could quite literally walk in any direction and find something to engage in, which was kind of a novel concept back then. And I'd argue that it still is to an extent, as there really aren't that many non-Bethesda games that quite scratch that build your own adventure itch. In Skyrim, the choice was yours from the moment you left the tutorial. You could engage in various epic storylines, set off to explore a far-flung corner of the map, or you could just go and randomly murder an innocent fisherman for his boots. Of course, it wasn't just the sheer volume of content and the freedom to choose that captured players' interest. It was the quality of the content itself, and the incredibly immersive environment that it created. In particular, the dynamic nature of many of the game's encounters and events made it genuinely difficult for players not to become immersed in Skyrim. Everywhere you went, the world was alive, and everyone you engaged with had something for you, a quest, some useful information, or even just a scene to play out. You couldn't go anywhere in Skyrim without becoming embroiled in something, be it an epic adventure leading to a Daedric artifact, or just a simple domestic spat. It's really no wonder that so many people played for hundreds of hours without even finishing the main quest. Every time you planned to head back to Whiterun to continue it, something else would inevitably pop up and distract you. I think it's safe to say that once the game got its hooks into you, it didn't let go easily. And I'm sure that I'm not the only one who had the experience of loading up the game for the first time and then looking up from the screen what felt like an hour later to realise that it was in fact 3 AM and my dinner was still sat next to me. Of course, stone cold at this point. Skyrim's ability to immerse the player was also certainly helped by the fact that the Elder Scrolls series is so incredibly rich in story and lore. The deep and fascinating world building that underpins Elder Scrolls games provided an incredible foundation on which to build the land, people, and events of Skyrim during the timeline in which the game is set. I'm not saying that they necessarily nailed the storytelling in every regard, but the constant feeling of being connected to Tamriel's deep and rich history certainly made me feel more invested in the world. This is quite a different feeling to play in an individual one-off title where you make a fleeting stop in a world that only exists within that one game. It's very difficult for a game like that to replicate the depth of an Elder Scrolls title, as it doesn't have over a decade of world building to draw upon. And frankly, it probably isn't even worth it to the developer of a standalone game to try and replicate that. Instead, these sorts of games will typically focus on a compelling main storyline, whereas in Skyrim, the history of Tamriel was woven into every part of the game. You would find little threads everywhere you looked, in books, in quests, in ancient tombs and monuments that you explored, all immersing you further and further into this fantastical realm. Now, we already talked about the vast volume of immersive content in the game, as well as the game's ability to tell a great story, but I think it's fair to say that some of that content stood head and shoulders above the rest. And I think it's worth drawing attention to the importance of the particularly memorable storylines that you no doubt have a vision of in your head right now. After all, these are the standout experiences that you'll remember with that warm sense of nostalgia. Of course, the quests that we remember most fondly will be different for each of us, but I'd bet the house that at least some of you will have the Dark Brotherhood or perhaps the Thieves Guild in your mind. But regardless of which questline most appealed to you, the point I'm trying to make is that the Elder Scrolls games have always done an excellent job of making the side content arguably better than the main story, and Skyrim is no exception. And I think there's actually some magic in this, which isn't often replicated in other games. The side content being as engaging, if not more engaging, supercharges that feeling of choice that we spoke about in the second point. This is because it actually feels worth your time to pursue something that isn't the main story, rather than feeling like any choice outside of the main story is some half-baked attempt to trick players into putting more hours into the game, and like the side content is really just filler content with little substance behind it. A standout example for me of where Skyrim excelled in immersing players in a side quest is when you're abducted by the Dark Brotherhood. The way that your actions in the game result in you unexpectedly waking up in this abandoned shack with this unthinkable choice to make, in my opinion, represents a rare and epic questing experience that I don't think many of us forgot in a hurry. It hooked you in, and regardless of what you were doing previously, you were suddenly immersed in this story, which was, strictly speaking, a side story. And perhaps most importantly of all, in terms of the game's success, this gave you an excellent talking point when recommending Skyrim to your friends. Another thing that I think Skyrim nailed when it came to attracting a more mainstream audience was the simplification of some of the game's systems, especially compared to some of the previous titles in the series. For example, Oblivion had some quite complex systems, especially when it came to leveling. And while this had its own charm, it was very off-putting to a lot of the more casual players, and it made the game far less accessible for the RPG curious, let's say. Skyrim very deliberately made these systems far simpler and more intuitive, therefore lowering the bar to entry and making the game approachable for those who didn't want to gain a PhD in efficient leveling for Oblivion. Sure, it also removed some of the deeper RPG systems that people like me enjoy, and I do have another video that talks about some of the things that I think Oblivion did better than Skyrim, but of course that's personal opinion, and clearly it was the right call from Bethesda in terms of capturing mainstream interest in the game. Now, the factors we've discussed so far explain why the game was so popular when it first came out, and how it captured people in their initial playthroughs. But perhaps an even more interesting question is how has Skyrim sustained that interest for well over a decade, when most other games, even massively popular ones at launch, are so often dead and buried within a few years? Well, the first and perhaps most obvious reason is that the game is just insanely replayable, due mostly to the massive variety of content and possibilities. No two playthroughs are the same, and for non-completionist players, which will actually be the vast majority of players, two playthroughs can in fact be totally different. This is because you can play the game for dozens of hours without even touching half of the content. And this has only been further compounded by the addition of the Dawn Guard and Dragonborn DLCs, which expanded that content offering even further. But even if you've played all of the content before, every single quest, there's still always a reason to go back, isn't there? Perhaps this time you want to try a different build, or take a different approach to how you handle the game's various choices. Perhaps you want to be an assassin or a thief, or maybe this time you want to take a more honourable path. In one way or another, I'd argue that everything we've talked about so far in this video contributes to Skyrim's incredible replayability. But it's not just replayability that's kept Skyrim alive and well for so long, it's more than that. It's being constantly reminded that it's there, waiting for you to jump back in. And this is because Skyrim is so embedded in gaming culture that you're never truly that far away from it. You're just sitting there minding your own business, and then some random YouTuber that you've never heard of makes a video, and as you watch it you start to develop that familiar itch. The one that can only be scratched by reinstalling Skyrim and starting that 17th playthrough, and once again pretending to yourself that you won't be making yet another stealth archer. And of course it's not just random YouTubers reminding you either, it's the constant references that have seeped into popular gaming culture, the memes, the arrows to the knee. Skyrim has just become so embedded in our culture that it'll always come back to tempt you in for a flagon of ale at the Bannered Mare, and perhaps a spot of dragon hunting. And last, but certainly not least, is modding. Or specifically the vast modding community that has formed around the game. For over a decade there has been an endless flow of talented individuals and teams producing new experiences for Skyrim players through the use of mods. Some of their achievements are just incredible, and they add whole new dimensions to the game. There seems to be a never-ending flow of ideas and creativity when it comes to enhancing the player experience through these tools. Sometimes it's about adding entire epic new quest lines, some of which are more engaging and immersive than the quests written by Bethesda themselves. And then sometimes it's just about making a dragon look like Thomas the Tank Engine. The sky's the limit when it comes to modding, and this ability to constantly refresh the game, however old it gets, gives Skyrim almost infinite replayability. Anyway, that's pretty much it from me on this topic. I'd be really keen to know your thoughts on why Skyrim became so popular in the comments. Also, if for some unknown reason you enjoy my ramblings, then maybe consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel for more RPG content in the future. And I will see you in the next one.